I never really talk about what happened that night in Palmdale. It's not the kind of story you casually bring up over coffee or drinks. People tend to brush things off, say you imagined it, that it was just a dream. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. I was about 10 or 11 at the time, just a kid trying to make sense of the world like everyone else. My family had moved to Palmdale not long before that. My dad got a job at an aerospace company, and we found this little house on the outskirts of town. It was one of those older neighborhoods where the houses all looked a little worn and tired, but the kind of place where you could still hear the crickets at night and the wind rustling through the trees. For the most part, it was quiet, peaceful even. At night, though, the town felt different. There was this strange stillness that would settle in. No traffic, no people, just the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. And the wind, it always felt colder at night, like it was creeping through every crack and window pane, no matter how tightly you tried to seal them. I remember lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the way the house creaked as the wind pressed against it. It was the kind of house that seemed to have a memory of its own, as if it could remember everyone who had lived there before us. I don't know. Maybe I was just a kid with an overactive imagination, but it always felt like the house was watching. It must have been late, after midnight, I think, when I first heard it. That soft, distant sound that pulled me out of a half-asleep haze. At first I thought it was just the wind, the way it whistled through the trees, but then I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was crying, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a baby crying somewhere in the distance. I sat up in bed, my heart beating a little faster as I listened closer. I couldn't make out where it was coming from, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern, short, pitiful sobs, like the baby was trying to catch its breath between the cries. I swung my legs out of bed and padded over to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, bathed in that soft orange glow from the streetlights, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Nothing moved. No cars, no people, just the crying. It sounded like it was coming from farther down the street, but I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a while, staring out into the quiet night, trying to make sense of it. Who would have a baby out at this time of night? And why would it be crying? I considered waking my parents, but something about the situation felt strange. I couldn't explain it, but there was this pull, like the sound was calling to me, like it wanted me to find it. So like an idiot, I decided to go. I grabbed a jacket, slipped on my sneakers, and crept out of my room as quietly as I could. My parents' room was at the other end of the hall, and I could hear my dad snoring softly through the door. They had no idea I was leaving. I tiptoed down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky steps, and slipped out the front door. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting, but that wasn't what made me stop. The crying, it was louder now. Closer. It was coming from somewhere farther down the street, past the row of houses and toward the edge of town where the old abandoned buildings were. I don't know why, but I didn't question it. I just walked. My breath puffed out in front of me, hanging in the air like a ghost, and the only sound, other than the crying, was the soft crunch of my sneakers on the gravelly sidewalk. The closer I got to the edge of town, the more uneasy I started to feel. The crying was louder, yes, but it was also more haunting. It was like the sound itself had started to change. It wasn't just a baby crying anymore. It was something else, something not quite right. Almost like it was mimicking a baby's cry, but not perfectly. The tone was too high, the rhythm too steady, like it was being played on repeat. I should have turned back then. I should have realized it wasn't natural. But I kept walking, drawn toward it like a moth to a flame. That's when I saw the building. It sat at the end of the road, just past an overgrown lot. The windows were boarded up, and the walls were covered in graffiti, peeling paint, flaking off in chunks. I knew the place. It had been abandoned for years. Some kind of medical clinic, I think, though no one ever really talked about it. It was the kind of place parents warned their kids not to go near. It had an aura to it, like bad things had happened there once, and maybe they still lingered in the air. And the crying, it was coming from inside. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the building. It loomed in front of me, dark and silent, except for that awful, pitiful cry echoing from within. I took a step closer, and then another, the cold air biting at my skin. Something about it felt wrong, though. The closer I got, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, like I was walking into something I wasn't supposed to see. I reached the edge of the lot and stopped. There was no one there, no baby, no sign of life at all. But the crying continued, echoing from behind the boarded-up windows, bouncing off the cracked walls. Louder now, desperate. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. There was no baby in that building. There was no anything in that building. But the crying was still there, drawing me closer, begging me to come inside. Something deep inside me screamed to turn back, to run, to get as far away from that place as I could. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot, but I couldn't move forward anymore. The pull was strong, but the fear was stronger now. I took a deep breath, forced myself to turn around, and ran. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears, the cold air burning in my lungs. The crying grew fainter as I fled, until it finally disappeared altogether, swallowed by the night. I didn't stop until I reached the front door of my house, slamming it shut behind me, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. I crept back upstairs, crawled into bed, and pulled the covers over my head, listening to the stillness of the house. I didn't sleep that night, not really. My mind kept replaying the sound of that cry, over and over again, like a broken record stuck on repeat. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Tried to convince myself that maybe it had just been a dream, some weird nightmare that felt too real. But the memory of that sound, it stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind, refusing to let go. It wasn't until later that day that I overheard my mom talking to one of the neighbors. I wasn't paying attention at first, just absent-mindedly playing with my toys, until I heard the word clinic. Yeah, it's been abandoned for years, my mom was saying. I heard it used to be a children's clinic, way back in the 60s, but there was some kind of accident, a fire maybe, and they shut it down. My blood ran cold. I felt my hands go numb as the pieces clicked into place. The building I'd nearly walked into that night wasn't just any old abandoned building. It had been a children's clinic, and the crying, it hadn't been some random noise. It was connected to that place, to whatever had happened there all those years ago. I wanted to ask my mom more, to find out exactly what she knew about the place, but I didn't. I didn't want her to know I'd been near it. I didn't want anyone to know. That night I lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. And even though I knew it was just my imagination, I swore I could hear it again, that faint, distant crying. But this time I stayed in bed, and I never went near that building again. Years have passed since that night. I'm older now, with a family of my own. I've moved far away from Palmdale, away from that house and that neighborhood, but the memory of that night still lingers. Every now and then, late at night, I'll hear a sound, just a random noise, something that shouldn't be significant, and it will remind me of that cry. That awful, pitiful cry that drew me out into the cold, into the night. I've tried to forget it, tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but deep down I know the truth. There's something about that place, something that's still there, waiting, calling out to anyone who will listen. And I'm just glad I didn't answer. You'd think moving away would put distance between you and something like that. The kind of distance where you can look back and convince yourself it was just a bad dream, that it was some overactive childhood imagination gone wild. But it didn't. In fact, the more I tried to forget about that night, the more it stayed with me. And I guess part of me always expected it to come back. For years I didn't hear the crying again, not like that night. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Every now and then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason, and I'd just listen to the dark, to the empty silence of the house, waiting for the faintest sound, and sometimes I swear I could hear it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe just the natural creaks of the house at night, but it was always familiar, that high, sharp wail echoing through the stillness. And every time I'd remember that building, the clinic. The thing is, I never could shake that final detail I overheard from my mom. the fire. She didn't know much about it, but as I got older, I started piecing things together, looking into the history of that place. Not publicly, of course. I didn't want to raise any questions. I was too embarrassed to tell people what had happened, and frankly, I wasn't sure I could explain it in a way that didn't make me sound crazy. But I needed answers, and the more I dug, the more unsettling the story became. Turns out the clinic had been closed in the early 1970s after a fire destroyed most of the interior. The official reports were vague, some kind of electrical fault, they said, though there were rumors that it wasn't an accident. The building had been a children's clinic, specializing in pediatric care. There were whispers about malpractice, about negligence, but nothing was ever proven. Still, a lot of families lost their kids to that fire. I read about it in old newspapers, the kind that yellow with age and crumble in your hands. Most of the kids who were there that night didn't make it out. When I found that out, the crying made more sense, in a way that I wished it didn't. I started to wonder if that's what I'd heard that night, a child trapped in that building calling for help. Maybe it was the spirit of one of the kids who never made it out, still crying for someone to come find them, still lost after all those years. Or maybe it was something worse, something pretending to be a child, using that familiar, innocent sound to draw me in. But I never got close enough to find out. At least, not back then. It's strange how the past has a way of catching up with you, even when you think you've left it behind. I'd moved away from Palmdale long ago, started my own family, found a career, all the things you're supposed to do when you grow up. But Palmdale, that place, it never really left me. Every now and then, I'd think about that house, that neighborhood, and the clinic. I'd wonder if it was still standing, if anyone else had ever heard the crying. But I didn't talk about it. Not with my wife, not with anyone. It was like a dirty little secret that I kept to myself, locked away in some dark corner of my mind. That changed last year. We were visiting my parents for the holidays, something we did every few years when we could make the trip. They still lived in the same town, not far from where we'd lived when I was a kid. The house was the same, mostly, just older, like everything else in that town. It was the night before we were supposed to leave, and I couldn't sleep. I'm not sure why, but the house felt different to me that night. The air was heavy, like the weight of the past was pressing down on me. Everyone else was asleep, my wife, our kids, my parents, but I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, just like I had all those years ago. And then I heard it, the crying. At first I thought it was a dream. It was so soft, so faint, that I wasn't even sure I'd heard it. But there it was again, that same high-pitched wail, distant but unmistakable, the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same pull. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. It was the exact same sound I'd heard that night when I was a kid. There was no mistaking it. And just like before, I felt that strange pull, like the sound wanted me to follow it, like it was leading me somewhere. I stood up, quietly, trying not to wake my wife. I don't know why, but I didn't want to explain what I was doing. I didn't want to say out loud that I'd heard the crying again. It felt too personal, too real. I slipped out of the bedroom and crept down the hallway, my steps slow and cautious, just like when I was a kid. The house creaked beneath my feet, and for a moment I stood there, listening to the stillness, half expecting the crying to stop. But it didn't. It was louder now, closer. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I followed the sound to the back door. The night outside was cold, just like before, and the wind howled through the trees, making the whole world feel empty and desolate. But the crying, it wasn't coming from the street this time. It wasn't coming from the old clinic. It was coming from inside the house. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was coming from the guest bedroom. My kids were in there, asleep. I felt my stomach twist with fear as I rushed down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. I pushed open the door, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My kids were still in bed, but the crying, it was coming from the corner of the room, from the shadows. I froze, my eyes straining to see, but there was nothing there, just the sound. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking, my pulse racing. The crying stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, in a small, forgotten town where the nights were long, cold, and dark. The kind of dark that felt alive. You know the kind, I mean, where the shadows seem to stretch out and grab you, where the wind howls through the trees, making everything feel like it's watching you. I guess living up there in those mountains, you learn to respect the quiet and the solitude, but I always felt like something else was in that quiet, something waiting. I never really thought much of it as a kid. It was just life. The mountains were beautiful during the day, with forests so thick that you could get lost in them for hours. But at night, they took on a different shape. My family's old house was perched on the side of a steep hill, surrounded by woods on every side. It was isolated, the kind of place where you didn't have neighbors for miles, and your closest company was the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. My parents always told me the mountains had a way of playing tricks on you, that you could hear voices carried on the wind or think you saw something that wasn't really there. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It all started when I was 7. That's when the dreams began. I can still remember the first one vividly, like it's burned into the back of my mind. It was winter, and the nights were bitterly cold. I had gone to bed early, wrapped up in layers of blankets to keep out the chill. My bedroom was small, tucked away at the back of the house, with a single window that looked out over the mountainside. From my bed I could see the tops of the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. That night, I dreamed of the woods. In the dream, I was walking through the forest behind our house. The moon was bright, casting everything in an eerie, silver glow, and the trees seemed taller, more menacing than usual. The air was cold, colder than I'd ever felt, and my breath hung in the air in thick clouds. I could hear something in the distance, just out of reach, like a soft voice calling my name. I don't know why, but I followed it. I walked deeper and deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, the voice growing louder, and then I saw him. Standing just at the edge of the clearing was a tall figure, dressed in a long black cloak that billowed in the wind. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel him watching me, his presence cold and suffocating. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at this dark figure, my heart racing in my chest. And then, without a word, he raised his hand and pointed at me. I woke up in a panic, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window. I sat there, trembling, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But something felt off. Something felt wrong. That's when I realized I wasn't in my bed. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, in a small, forgotten town where the nights were long, cold, and dark. The kind of dark that felt alive. You know the kind, I mean, where the shadows seem to stretch out and grab you, where the wind howls through the trees, making everything feel like it's watching you. I guess living up there in those mountains, you learn to respect the quiet and the solitude, but I always felt like something else was in that quiet, something waiting. I never really thought much of it as a kid. It was just life. The mountains were beautiful during the day, with forests so thick that you could get lost in them for hours. But at night, they took on a different shape. My family's old house was perched on the side of a steep hill, surrounded by woods on every side. It was isolated, the kind of place where you didn't have neighbors for miles, and your closest company was the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. My parents always told me the mountains had a way of playing tricks on you, that you could hear voices carried on the wind or think you saw something that wasn't really there. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It all started when I was 7. That's when the dreams began. I can still remember the first one vividly, like it's burned into the back of my mind. It was winter, and the nights were bitterly cold. I had gone to bed early, wrapped up in layers of blankets to keep out the chill. My bedroom was small, tucked away at the back of the house, with a single window that looked out over the mountainside. From my bed I could see the tops of the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. That night, I dreamed of the woods. In the dream, I was walking through the forest behind our house. The moon was bright, casting everything in an eerie, silver glow, and the trees seemed taller, more menacing than usual. The air was cold, colder than I'd ever felt, and my breath hung in the air in thick clouds. I could hear something in the distance, just out of reach, like a soft voice calling my name. I don't know why, but I followed it. I walked deeper and deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around me, the voice growing louder, and then I saw him. Standing just at the edge of the clearing was a tall figure, dressed in a long black cloak that billowed in the wind. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but I could feel him watching me, his presence cold and suffocating. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at this dark figure, my heart racing in my chest. And then, without a word, he raised his hand and pointed at me. I woke up in a panic, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window. I sat there, trembling, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But something felt off. Something felt wrong. That's when I realized I wasn't in my bed. I was standing outside, barefoot, in the snow. The cold hit me all at once, and I looked around, confused, disoriented. I was standing just outside the house, the snow up to my ankles, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The moon was bright overhead, casting long shadows across the yard. I didn't remember getting up, didn't remember walking outside, but there I was. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. I didn't tell my parents. I couldn't. How could I explain it? It must have been sleepwalking, I told myself. Just a bad dream that somehow spilled into reality. It happened to kids all the time, right? But it didn't stop. The dreams came almost every night after that, always the same. I'd find myself walking through the woods, the moon lighting my way, and I'd hear the voice calling my name, faint and distant. Every time I'd see the tall figure in black, standing in the clearing, his face hidden, his hand pointing at me. And every time I'd wake up outside, shivering in the cold, confused and terrified. My parents started noticing. I couldn't hide it forever. They'd find me in the early hours of the morning, standing in the yard, barefoot and freezing, or sitting on the porch steps, staring out into the woods. They were worried, of course. They thought I was sleepwalking, but no matter what they did, locking the doors, setting alarms, I always ended up outside, drawn by something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't just the dreams anymore. I started seeing things when I was awake, too. Shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye, figures standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. Once, when I was playing in the yard, I looked up and saw a woman's face staring at me from the window of my room. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. I screamed, running back inside to tell my mom, but when we went up to check the room, there was nothing there. But I knew what I'd seen. The woman, her face was burned into my memory. And then there was the whispering. I'd be lying in bed, the house quiet around me, and I'd hear it, soft, almost like a breeze, but with words. At first, it was faint, just barely there, like someone was speaking from another room. But over time, it grew louder, clearer, and it was always the same thing, over and over. Come outside. It was like the voices were trying to lure me out, trying to get me to leave the safety of the house. And sometimes, I could almost hear them laughing like they were toying with me. The worst part was, I felt it working. I felt that same pull I had in the dreams, that irresistible urge to get out of bed, to walk out into the cold and follow the voices into the woods. But I fought it. As much as I could, I fought it. It's been years since then, but the memory of those nights still haunts me. I've tried to forget, tried to push it all to the back of my mind, but the dreams haven't stopped. They're not as frequent now, but every once in a while I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and I'll hear that same whisper, "Come outside." And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, I'll look out my window and see her. The woman, standing at the edge of the woods, her smile wide and cruel, waiting for me. I've never gone back to the Appalachian Mountains, and I never will. You'd think leaving the Appalachian Mountains would have been enough, that moving away, putting miles and years between me and whatever haunted those woods, would make it stop. But it never did. The truth is, no matter how far you run, there are some things that stick to you, things you can't shake, no matter how hard you try to forget. That whisper, "Come outside," still haunts me. I hear it in the dead of night when the house is quiet and the wind outside sounds like a voice just barely out of reach. I'll wake up, covered in sweat, the weight of that old fear pressing down on me like a blanket I can't escape. I'll lie there, frozen, listening for the sound of her laugh, for the faint shuffle of feet just outside my door. It's been years since we left those mountains, but I swear, sometimes I can still feel her presence. The woman, the tall figure, like they're watching me from just beyond the veil of the waking world, waiting for me to slip back into their grasp. I hadn't thought about them for a long time, not really. Life had a way of moving forward, carrying me along with it. I went to college, got a job, met someone, tried to build something normal. And for a while, I even convinced myself that it was all just a part of my childhood. The sleepwalking, the dreams, the strange voices, they were just things that happened in an old, isolated house. But deep down, I always knew that was a lie. It was about a year ago now when it happened again. I was living in a small apartment at the time, just on the edge of town, nothing fancy. The place was cozy, but it had that same kind of quietness that the old house in the mountains had, the kind of quiet that makes you feel exposed, like the walls aren't thick enough to keep whatever's out there from slipping in. I'd just gotten off work and was feeling exhausted, so I went to bed early. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you want to bury yourself under blankets. I remember falling asleep almost immediately, my body heavy with the weight of the day. And then, sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the blinds. Everything was still, too still. I lay there for a moment, my heart beating steadily in my chest, telling myself it was just a bad dream. But the feeling in the air, it was familiar, that same cold, suffocating presence I hadn't felt in years. I turned over, trying to settle back into sleep, but then I heard it. A sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, like something brushing against the window. Tap, tap, tap. My entire body went rigid. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. Too steady. I held my breath, listening, telling myself it was just the wind, just the trees. But the tapping didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Slowly I turned my head to look. The blinds were half drawn, and in the pale moonlight I could just make out a shadow, a figure standing outside, pressed against the glass. Tall, cloaked in black. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest. It was him, the tall figure from my dreams, the one who'd haunted me for years. He was standing right outside my window, his face hidden in shadow, just as it had been all those nights in the woods. I wanted to scream, to get out of bed, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body locked in fear. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something unnatural. The tapping continued, relentless. Tap, tap, tap. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the window, waiting for something to happen, for the figure to move, to do something. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, his presence a cold, dark weight pressing against the glass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a sound, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder. A voice. "Come outside." It was her voice. The woman. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for me. That same sickly sweet voice that had haunted my childhood dreams, that had called to me from the woods all those years ago. "Come outside." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew what they wanted. They'd been waiting for me, waiting for the right moment, and now they'd found me again. I felt that familiar pull, that terrible, irresistible urge to get out of bed, to open the window, to follow the voice into the cold night. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I forced myself to move, to pull the blankets tighter around me, my hands trembling. I wasn't that scared kid anymore. I wasn't going to let them take me. Not this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, trying to shut it all out. For what felt like hours, I lay there, refusing to move, refusing to give in. And slowly, slowly, the voice began to fade. By the time I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. Since that night, things have changed. I moved out of that apartment the next week, convinced that leaving would stop whatever was following me. But the truth is, it doesn't matter where I go. They're always there, lingering just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't see them as often now, not like that night, but I can still feel them. In the quiet moments, when the world is still and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can sense them. The tall figure, the woman with her twisted smile, they're out there, watching, waiting. Every now and then, I'll wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, my body drenched in sweat, and I'll listen for the tap on the window or the faintest hint of that terrible whisper. Come outside. And sometimes when the night is particularly quiet, when the wind dies down and the world goes still, I'll catch a glimpse of her. Just for a second. A flash of white skin, a shadow in the corner of my vision. She's still waiting for me. She always will be. I've come to accept that now. They're part of my life, part of my history. I don't know why they chose me or what they want, but I know one thing. They'll never stop, they'll never let me go, and I'll never answer their call. Because I know deep down, if I ever do, if I ever let them in again, I won't come back. Not this time. And maybe that's what they've been waiting for all along. That summer of 2001, when we decided to go camping, was supposed to be one of those classic family vacations. You know, the kind where you leave behind the hustle of everyday life and just escape into nature, sitting around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling silly stories. It was me, my parents, and my little sister, Claire, packed into our old Subaru, heading out to some state park I can't even remember the name of anymore. It was one of those summers where everything felt sticky, hot, humid, and thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. My dad had picked the campground, a small place tucked away in the hills, far enough from civilization that we didn't have cell service. He thought it'd be good for us to unplug for a while, though now that I think about it, he was probably just trying to save some money. No matter the reason, we were out there, a couple of tents pitched under a canopy of towering trees that swayed like giants in the evening breeze. It was all fine for the first day or so. We set up camp, went on a hike, swam in the lake nearby. Claire, who was only about 8 at the time, was thrilled to be outside, running around like a maniac, poking at bugs and climbing on rocks. And me? I wasn't as excited. I was 12, and I'd rather have been home with my friends, playing video games or watching movies. But even I had to admit that there was something nice about the quiet out there. The stillness of the woods, the way the wind rustled through the leaves, there was something peaceful about it. But then, things took a turn. It was the second night when I started to feel sick. It came on quickly, almost out of nowhere, like I'd been hit with something heavy. We were sitting around the campfire, my dad telling one of his usual dumb jokes, when my stomach started to churn. At first, I thought it was something I ate, maybe the hot dogs we'd roasted over the fire. But then the nausea was followed by a wave of dizziness, and I felt this deep, aching chill creep into my bones, despite the summer heat. "I don't feel so good," I remember saying, my voice shaky. My mom glanced over, her face immediately creasing with concern. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, standing up and placing the back of her hand against my forehead. Her eyes widened a little. "You're burning up." I didn't even have the strength to argue. My head was swimming, and the firelight seemed to blur and twist in front of me. My parents decided I needed to rest, so I staggered over to the tent, collapsing into my sleeping bag, hoping the feeling would pass. But it didn't. If anything, the fever got worse. I lay there, sweating and shivering at the same time, feeling trapped inside my own body. My head throbbed with every beat of my heart, and my thoughts felt sluggish, like I was sinking into some kind of fevered dream. That's when I first heard it. At first it was faint, just a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving through the trees around our campsite. I didn't think much of it. It's the woods, right? There are always animals scurrying about, or the wind shaking the branches. But then, the sound became more distinct. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. I stared at the tent walls, half expecting to hear Claire's voice, thinking maybe she was wandering around outside. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant crackle of the dying campfire. And then I heard the cry. It started off soft, like a child whimpering, barely loud enough to hear. At first, I thought it was Claire. Maybe she'd gotten scared or hurt herself while I was resting. But as I listened, I realized something was off. The cry, it wasn't coming from our campsite. It was coming from deeper in the woods. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound, like a little kid calling out for help. My stomach twisted, and for a moment I debated getting up and checking on Claire. But when I glanced over at where she was sleeping, I could see the rise and fall of her chest, her small form bundled up under blankets, completely still. So if Claire was asleep, who was crying? The sound grew louder, more frantic. It was unmistakably the sound of a child in distress, but it didn't make any sense. There shouldn't have been anyone else out there. We were the only campers in that section of the park, and the nearest town was miles away. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the wind or maybe my fever playing tricks on my mind. But the crying didn't stop. It kept going, getting closer and closer, until I could almost feel it vibrating in my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was thick, oppressive, like the entire forest was holding its breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, and every muscle in my body was tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. That's when I heard the branch snap. It was loud, sharp, and close, like something heavy had stepped on it. I held my breath, my eyes wide, staring at the shadowy walls of the tent. Whatever had made that sound, it was right outside. My brain raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself, a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too deliberate, the sounds too human. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, and I wanted to call out for my parents, but something stopped me. It was like a voice in the back of my mind, whispering, "Don't make a sound, don't let it know you're here." I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees and the soft flapping of the tent in the breeze. Whatever had been outside, it was gone. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. I must have drifted off into a feverish sleep after that, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of distant thunder. The air had changed. The humidity was heavier, and the distant rumble of an approaching storm echoed through the forest. But that wasn't what woke me. No, it was something else. It was the sound of a motorcycle. Now at first, I was confused. There shouldn't have been anyone else around, let alone someone riding a motorcycle through the woods in the middle of the night. The sound was distant, but growing louder, like it was approaching from somewhere far down the road. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, and listened as the sound of the engine grew closer. It had that low, rumbling growl you'd expect from an old, heavy bike, one of those big, bulky ones that roar when they accelerate. But the weird thing was, no matter how close the sound got, I couldn't see anything. No headlights, no flash of movement, nothing. The engine roared louder, and then, just like with the crying, it stopped. Completely. It was as if someone had turned it off right outside our campsite. But when I peeked out through the small flap in the tent, the woods were empty. No bike, no people. Just the dark shapes of the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional flash of distant lightning on the horizon. I could feel my pulse quicken, that strange mix of fear and confusion tightening in my chest. I wanted to wake my parents, but something about the silence felt wrong, like whatever was out there was waiting for me to do just that. And then I heard it again, the crying. It was louder now, closer, that same awful high-pitched wail echoing through the trees. It was coming from the same direction as before, but this time it felt like it was right outside our campsite. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, this primal instinct to help, to find whoever was making that terrible noise. But at the same time, I knew it wasn't right. The crying, the motorcycle, the sounds that didn't belong, it was all wrong. I lay there, my body stiff with fear, listening to the crying, listening to the sound of branches snapping underfoot like something or someone was moving closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. And then, just as the crying seemed to reach the edge of our camp, it stopped again. Dead silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I don't know how long I lay there waiting, terrified, But eventually I must have passed out from the fever or exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, my dad was shaking me awake. "We're leaving," he said, his voice low and serious. "Pack your things." The sun hadn't even risen yet, but I could tell from the tension in his voice that something had spooked him. I didn't ask questions. I just scrambled to gather my stuff, my heart racing, adrenaline kicking in. My mom was already packing up the tent, her face pale, eyes wide. Claire was clinging to her, scared but quiet. Within minutes, we were in the car, driving away from the campsite, the storm clouds chasing us down the mountain road. No one said a word for the first hour. The tension in the car was thick, like we were all trying to shake off the strange, creeping fear that had followed us from the woods. It wasn't until we were miles away that my dad finally spoke. "I heard it too," he said quietly, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "The crying, the footsteps, and that damn motorcycle." I looked at him, my mouth dry, but before I could say anything, he shook his head. "We're not talking about this again," he muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's over." But it wasn't. Not for me. Because even now, all these years later, I can still hear it. The crying, the snapping branches, the roar of the engine that never came. And every time I think back to that night, I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did? You'd think that after we left the campsite, after we packed up in such a rush and drove away in the darkness, the fear would have faded. That whatever it was we heard that night, the crying, the footsteps, the motorcycle, it would stay behind in those woods, swallowed by the trees and the cold summer rain. But it didn't. Even as we drove farther and farther away, that sick, twisting feeling in my gut stayed with me. The quiet dread that had settled over us, the unspoken terror in my dad's voice when he said he heard it too, it followed us. And it followed me for years. I tried not to think about it after that. Tried to forget, just like my dad said we would. For the longest time, we never talked about it. My mom never mentioned the fear in her eyes as she packed up the tent, and my dad didn't bring up the strange, unexplainable sounds we'd all heard that night. Even Claire, young as she was, seemed to sense that something had happened, something we weren't supposed to understand. She stopped asking questions after a while, though I'd catch her staring at me sometimes, her little face pinched with worry, like she knew something was wrong but didn't know how to put it into words. I guess none of us did. After that camping trip, I thought I could push it all down, bury it like it was just some bad memory that would eventually fade with time. But it didn't. If anything, it grew, slowly, quietly, like a shadow creeping in the corners of my mind. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it all, that the fever had caused some kind of hallucination. But every time I thought about that night, I could feel the reality of it deep in my bones. It wasn't just the fever. We all heard those sounds. The crying, the footsteps, the motorcycle that came out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. They were real. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home, like whatever it was out there hadn't finished with us. For weeks after the trip, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it again, first faint, then louder. That high-pitched, desperate wail of a child in the woods. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, listening to the quiet house around me, waiting for something to happen. I could feel it, the tension in the air, like I was holding my breath, waiting for the next branch to snap, for the next voice to call out from the darkness. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swore I could hear the soft hum of a distant motorcycle, its low rumble fading in and out like it was circling, waiting. One night, maybe a month after the trip, I woke up suddenly. No fever this time, no sickness, just a sharp, bone-deep panic, the kind that hits you before you even realize what's wrong. I sat up, blinking in the darkness, trying to figure out what had jolted me awake. Everything was still, too still. The house was quiet, my parents' soft breathing just audible through the thin walls, but something was off. I felt it before I heard it, a heavy presence, like the air had thickened around me. My chest tightened and I strained to listen, my ears on high alert. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard it. Snap. It was subtle at first, just the sound of a branch breaking in the distance, but it was enough to send a cold wave of fear down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. Snap. Closer this time. I wanted to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering through the backyard, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too human. Just like at the campsite. Snap. This time, it was right outside the window. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the window, the curtains drawn, praying I wouldn't hear it again, praying I wouldn't have to get up and see what was out there. But before I could move, the sound changed. The snapping stopped, and in its place, I heard something worse. The crying. It was faint at first, just like before, like a child, lost and scared, calling out for someone. My heart hammered in my chest, and I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. That high-pitched, mournful wail, echoing in the silence of the night. I wanted to scream, to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't move. It was like something was holding me in place, keeping me pinned to the bed. All I could do was listen as the crying grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right outside the window, the sound filling the room, pressing down on me. And then, just as it had before, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and heavy with the kind of tension that makes every nerve in your body scream. I was shaking, my hands clenched into fists under the covers, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I waited, counting the seconds, hoping that whatever had been out there was gone. But then, through the thick silence, I heard it. The low, unmistakable rumble of a motorcycle engine. It was distant at first, just a faint hum, but it grew louder, more distinct. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to sit up, my body trembling. I knew there was no motorcycle outside. I knew there was no road near our house, no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of the night. But the sound was real, just like it had been at the campsite. The engine roared louder, like it was coming straight toward me, like it was closing in, and I could feel that same icy terror creeping up my spine. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking, and rushed to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I ripped the curtains open, staring out into the night. Nothing. The yard was empty. The trees stood still, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. No headlights, no movement. Just darkness. And then silence. The motorcycle was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know how long I stood there staring out into the night, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, my entire body trembling with a fear I couldn't explain. The next morning, I tried to bring it up to my parents, but they brushed it off. My dad just muttered something about bad dreams and how the mind plays tricks on you. But I knew better. I could see it in his eyes, the same fear I'd seen that night when we fled the campsite. He wasn't just dismissing me. He was trying to protect me from something he couldn't explain either. We never did talk about it. Not after that night. My parents were set on forgetting, and I don't blame them. Some things you don't want to remember. Some things are better left buried. But the fear never really left me. Even now, as an adult, I still think about that summer. The sounds, the way the woods felt alive with something we couldn't see, something that was waiting, watching us from the shadows. Sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I'll hear a faint sound, a branch snapping, the distant hum of an engine, and my heart will skip a beat. I'll listen, waiting for the crying to start again, waiting for that awful wail that pulls at something deep inside me. And sometimes, just for a second, I think I do hear it. That same high-pitched cry, echoing in the back of my mind, distant but always there. I never go camping anymore. I can't. Not after what happened. Because I know that whatever was out there, whatever followed us that night, it's still waiting. It never really went away. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or demons. Honestly, I used to roll my eyes when people talked about that kind of stuff. Hauntings, possessions, things creeping around in the dark. It all felt like some kind of trick, you know? The brain playing games, especially when you're alone at night, half asleep, and the shadows on the walls start to move. I used to think, there's always a rational explanation. But what happened to me? I still can't explain it, and I've stopped trying. Because sometimes, the things we try to rationalize, they're not meant to be understood. It started about 2 years ago, during one of those long, stressful weeks when everything in life seems to be falling apart. I was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. I couldn't sleep right, and when I did, I'd wake up more tired than before. That kind of exhaustion messes with your head, makes you see things that aren't there. Or at least, that's what I told myself at first. The first night it happened, I woke up in the dark, gasping for air like I'd just run a marathon. My sheets were tangled around my legs, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't a nightmare, not exactly, but it felt like I'd been ripped out of some deep, dark dream that I couldn't remember. The room was cold, colder than it should have been, and I could hear the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a bad night, that I'd been working too hard and my mind was playing tricks. But then I noticed something strange. The door to my bedroom was open. Now, I always sleep with the door closed. Always. It's just a habit I've had since I was a kid. I can't sleep if it's open. It makes me feel too exposed. But there it was, wide open, the darkness of the hallway beyond it spilling into the room like ink. I sat up, staring at it, my pulse quickening again. Had I gotten up in the middle of the night? Maybe I'd opened it myself without realizing. I stood up, my legs shaky, and went to close it, trying to push down the rising unease in my chest. But as I reached for the doorknob, I stopped. There was a shadow, standing at the far end of the hallway. I couldn't make out any details, but it was there. A tall, dark figure, just standing in the shadows, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. No one was in my house. I lived alone. But there it was, still, silent, staring. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't know what I expected to happen, maybe for it to move, to lunge at me something, but it didn't. It just stood there. And the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt. Like it wasn't just a shadow, but something else. Something that didn't belong. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling, and backed away until I hit the bed. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the mattress, my whole body shaking. I waited, listening for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything, but the house was silent. Too silent. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the covers up to my chin like a kid trying to hide from the monsters under the bed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, staring at the door, waiting for it to open again, but it didn't. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. I told myself it was just a hallucination, something brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Maybe I was sleepwalking, maybe the shadow was just my tired mind playing tricks. I didn't even let myself entertain the possibility that it was something more. But that night, it happened again. This time, I woke up around 2 a.m., my body drenched in cold sweat. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, and there was this overwhelming feeling of dread sitting heavy in my chest, like something was terribly, terribly wrong. I tried to shake it off, but then I noticed the same thing as the night before. The door was open, wide open. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked out into the hallway, half expecting to see that shadow again, but the hall was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Like there were 1,000 eyes on me, waiting for me to do something. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it was there. A voice, speaking from somewhere in the dark. I couldn't make out the words, but it was cold, sharp, and sent a shiver down my spine. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak, and ran to the door, slamming it shut like before. My heart was racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to breathe, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to get through the door, like something was on the other side. I backed away, my pulse thudding in my ears, and sat on the edge of the bed. I could hear it clearly now, a voice, soft but clear, calling my name. Come out. It was taunting, teasing, like it was trying to coax me out of the room. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body was frozen in place, trapped by this primal, gut-wrenching fear that if I opened that door, I wouldn't be able to close it again. And then, just like that, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick, suffocating, like the air in the room had been sucked out. I sat there, shaking, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The door was closed, the sunlight streaming through the window. I wanted to believe it was all a dream, but the fear I felt, it was too real. The memory of that voice, that whisper, it lingered like a bad taste in the back of my throat. For the next few nights, things only got worse. The whispering came back, night after night, always right around 2 a.m. It was never loud, never angry, but it was constant, soft, insistent, like something was trying to talk to me, trying to lure me out of the safety of my room. I started sleeping with the lights on, but that didn't help. The voice didn't care. It would start with that same faint whisper, then build until it was almost inside my head. I stopped sleeping. Every time I'd drift off, I'd feel the cold. Not just in the room, but inside me, like something was crawling into my skin, freezing me from the inside out. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the whispering starting all over again. And then, one night, the dreams began. They weren't dreams, really. They felt more like visions. I'd be lying in bed, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, and I'd see them. Dark figures standing around my bed, watching me. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hollow. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body as they loomed over me, their whispers filling the room. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it felt like they were talking about me, discussing me, like I was some kind of prey they were waiting to devour. One night, I woke up in the middle of one of these dreams, except this time, I wasn't in my bed. I was standing in the middle of my living room, barefoot, the cold wooden floor freezing against my skin. The lights were off, and the house was silent, but I wasn't alone. I could feel them, those figures, standing just outside my vision, watching me from the shadows. I turned slowly, my whole body trembling, and there they were, 3 of them, standing in the doorway to the hall. Tall, faceless figures, their outlines blurry and shifting like smoke. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, and my vision started to blur. The whispers were louder now, circling around me, filling my head until I thought I might scream. And then, just as my legs gave out and I collapsed to the floor, they spoke. "You belong to us." That's when everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in bed. My sheets were soaked with sweat, my body aching all over, and my mind was a foggy mess. I didn't know how I'd gotten there, didn't remember falling asleep, but the memory of the night, the figures, the whispers was clear as day.
Honestly, I still don't fully understand what happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It was real. So this all happened when I was on a road trip. I had some time off, and I thought I'd just drive and explore parts of the country I'd never seen before. Just me, the open road, and a playlist of all my favorite songs. It was late fall October, when the trees were shedding the last of their leaves, and there was this bite in the air that told you winter wasn't far off. I'd been driving for hours that day, crossing state lines without really paying attention, just soaking in the solitude. It was getting late, though, and I needed a place to stay for the night. I didn't plan ahead. I never do. I just figured I'd find a small-town motel or something. You know the type, those roadside places with flickering neon signs. But as I was driving, I saw this old, grand-looking building off the highway. It was sort of hidden by trees, but its looming shape caught my eye. Big, almost Victorian-style architecture, you know? One of those buildings that just screams history and secrets. I wasn't really planning on staying there. It looked way too fancy for a night's rest. But then I saw the sign out front, the Ashbrook Inn, historic and welcoming guests since 1927. What really got me, though, was the next line, "Stay if you dare." Now, I know it's cheesy, probably a marketing thing, right? But something about that sign intrigued me. I'm a sucker for spooky stories, so I thought, why not? Worst case, it's just another old hotel with a creepy backstory made up to lure in tourists. I pulled into the gravel driveway, the car tires crunching under the weight, and parked. It wasn't until I got out and looked at the place up close that I realized just how worn down it was. The building was huge, towering over the landscape like it was challenging nature itself to reclaim it. The windows were tall and narrow, but many were dark, and I could swear I saw cracks in some of the glass. There was ivy growing up the sides of the building, twisting and nodding around the stone walls like it had a life of its own. The front entrance was this massive wooden door, probably original to the hotel, with brass handles that looked like they hadn't been polished in years. But what really struck me was the silence. The wind had picked up a little, rustling the leaves in the trees, but the hotel itself was deathly quiet. No lights in the lobby that I could see, no movement from inside. For a moment, I thought maybe it was closed, abandoned even, but then I noticed a dim light flickering in one of the upper windows, like someone had a candle going, and there was this coldness in the air that made me shiver, though I wasn't sure if it was the temperature or something else. I should have left right then, but I didn't.
I grabbed my bag from the car and walked up to the front door, giving it a hesitant knock. The sound echoed in this eerie way, like the building was hollow. A few seconds passed, and I was about to turn around and head back to my car when the door creaked open. Standing there was this old man, maybe in his 70s, with a thin frame and sunken eyes that seemed way too sharp for his age. He had this slow, deliberate way of speaking, like he was choosing each word carefully. "Welcome to Ashbrook Inn," he said. "You're just in time." "In time for what?" I asked, half joking, trying to shake off the nerves that were starting to crawl up my spine. He didn't answer, just smiled. "Shall I show you to your room?" I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I was too tired to think straight, or maybe I was just curious. I followed him inside, and the lobby was exactly what you'd expect from an old hotel like that. High ceilings, chandeliers that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades, and faded wallpaper that might have once been elegant but was now peeling in some spots. There was an old wooden desk with a ledger on it, and behind it, a staircase that led up into darkness. The man led me up those stairs, and the further we went, the colder it got. I couldn't see any radiators or heating vents, and I started to feel this unease settling in my chest. The air had that kind of chill that isn't just physical, you know? It was like the building itself didn't want me there. We finally reached the second floor, and he led me down a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. Every door was shut tight, and there was this heavy silence hanging in the air, like the whole place was holding its breath. My room was at the very end, room 214. The man opened the door for me, and I stepped inside. The room was, well, it was strange. It had that old-fashioned look, heavy wooden furniture, a bed with a canopy, and a massive mirror on the wall opposite the bed. But everything seemed off. The bed was perfectly made, but the sheets looked like they hadn't been touched in years. There was a thick layer of dust on the dresser, but the mirror was spotless. And the air in the room was stifling, like no one had opened a window in decades. The old man didn't say much as he handed me the key. Just gave me that same strange smile and said, "Sleep well." Then he turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. I stood there for a minute, just taking it all in. Something wasn't right. The room felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion and my overactive imagination. I unpacked a few things and sat on the edge of the bed. That's when I noticed it, the mirror. At first, it seemed like nothing, just my reflection staring back at me, but as I looked closer, something shifted. It wasn't me. I mean, it looked like me, but the reflection's eyes were wrong. They were darker, almost hollow, like they were staring through me instead of at me. I blinked, and the reflection blinked back, but there was a lag, a fraction of a second delay that made my heart skip. I stood up, backing away from the mirror, but I couldn't tear my eyes from it. The reflection started to smile, but I wasn't smiling. I turned away, refusing to look at it anymore, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of that room. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. It was stuck, like something was holding it closed from the other side. My hands were shaking now, and the coldness in the room was unbearable. I started banging on the door, calling out, but no one came. Then I heard it, a whisper, low and raspy, coming from the mirror. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The reflection was still there, but now there was something else. A figure standing just behind me in the reflection. Tall, dark, with eyes that seemed to glow. I spun around, but the room was empty. Yet in the mirror it was still there, closer now, its hand reaching toward me. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, the door wide open, and the room was freezing, colder than before. I stumbled to my feet and ran out of there, not stopping until I was in my car, peeling out of the driveway. But here's the thing that's been keeping me up at night. Even after I'd gotten back to my car and put some serious distance between myself and that hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just fear. It was this deep, gnawing feeling in my gut, like I hadn't fully escaped whatever was in that room. I tried to rationalize it on the drive. I told myself that maybe I was just overtired. It had been a long day, and my mind must have been playing tricks on me, right? I mean, hallucinations can happen when you're exhausted. And that cold air, well, it was late October, after all. The heater in that old place probably didn't work. I wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. But something kept nagging at me. The way the door wouldn't open, the reflection in the mirror that wasn't quite mine, and that figure standing behind me. I kept driving for hours after that, through the night, not really caring where I was going, as long as I was getting farther away from Ashbrook Inn. It wasn't until I hit a small town the next morning that I stopped to get some coffee and try to clear my head. The diner was one of those old-school places, complete with vinyl booths and a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the 80s. The comforting normalcy of it made me feel a little better, like maybe I could finally put that night behind me. I sat at the counter, sipping my coffee, when I overheard a couple of locals talking about nearby places to stay. I couldn't help myself. I asked them if they knew anything about Ashbrook Inn. At first, they just stared at me like I'd asked something strange, but then one of the older men, probably in his 60s, leaned in a little closer. "You stayed at the Ashbrook?" he asked, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. I nodded, not really wanting to get into it, but curious to hear what he knew. He gave me a look I couldn't quite read, somewhere between pity and warning. "Place has been closed for years," he said, shaking his head. "At least, it should have been." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced around before continuing. "It used to be a cancer treatment center, back in the 1950s or so. They claimed to have this miracle cure, something that could heal people without the harsh side effects of radiation and chemo. People came from all over the country to be treated there." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee, and I leaned in, urging him to go on. But the truth was, it was all a scam. They weren't curing anyone. In fact, most of the patients died. And they didn't just pass away peacefully either. From what I've heard, the treatments they were given, well, they left them worse off. Some were in agony for months, begging for help, but the doctors there just kept pushing their so-called cure. By the time it was exposed, it was too late. A lot of people had already died, and the place was shut down. But some say the spirits of those patients, they never left. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the air in the diner had suddenly dropped a few degrees. "They turned it into a hotel in the late 70s, he continued. But people started reporting strange things. Guests would check in and then leave in the middle of the night. Some even said they saw figures, shadows. Others claimed they'd wake up with bruises or scratches that they couldn't explain. The place got a reputation, and eventually it just stopped operating." I swallowed hard. The man's words confirmed what I'd feared. "But I was just there last night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There was an old man at the desk, and he gave me a key to my room." The man frowned, and the waitress behind the counter who'd been listening in chimed in. "There hasn't been anyone working there in years, Han. The last owner died about 5 years ago. An old man, yeah, but he didn't have anyone to take over. That building's been abandoned ever since." I felt the blood drain from my face. That cold, gnawing feeling came rushing back, worse than before. If the place had been abandoned for years, then who or what had let me in? Who had I spoken to? I left the diner in a daze, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want answers to. I kept trying to make sense of it, to tell myself there was a logical explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that logic wasn't going to help me here. A few days later, I did some research, hoping that maybe I could find out more about the place, something that would give me peace of mind. But what I found only made things worse. The old hotel had a long history of strange occurrences, and there were countless stories from people who claimed to have seen ghosts, experienced bizarre phenomena, or even been physically harmed during their stay. But here's the part that still haunts me. One of the articles I found had a photograph, an old grainy black and white image of the hotel lobby from the 1930s. Standing behind the front desk, clear as day, was the man who had given me the key to my room. He hadn't aged a day. I don't know what's worse, the fact that I stayed in a place like that, or the fact that I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still feel the cold from that room creeping up my spine. And when I look in the mirror, I can't help but wonder if one day I'll see something looking back that isn't quite me. I've always been the type to keep to myself. You know, the quiet one, shy maybe, but not in a bad way. I just didn't need to be the center of attention like some kids did. I preferred being comfortable, blending in. That's why what happened to me is so hard to explain. It still feels unreal, like a bad dream I can't shake, even though I know it was real. I felt it, I saw it, and I still can't understand why it happened to me. It all started when my brother and I took those swimming lessons. We were both 10 at the time, my twin brother David and me. It was kind of a tradition by that point. Every Friday night after school, our parents would drop us off at the community center for our swim class. The lessons weren't too serious, just fun, really. And afterward, our favorite part was always the hot tub. They had this big hot tub by the pool, and after a week of school, there was nothing better than sinking into that hot, bubbling water. You'd think everything about it was great, and for a while it was. But then he started showing up. I don't even know how to describe him properly. The first time I saw him, I thought he was just another regular at the pool. You know, the kind of person you see every week but never really talk to. He was tall, taller than anyone else in the pool area, and thin. Almost too thin, like his clothes were hanging off him. His skin was what really stood out, though. It was red. Not like sunburned, but this unnatural, deep red. I thought maybe he had some kind of skin condition. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, people look different all the time, right? But what really got to me was the way he stared. He would just stand there, off to the side near the pool's edge, or sometimes by the hot tub. He never got in the water, never even dipped a toe in. He'd just watch, and not in a casual passing way. No, he was focused, like his eyes were locked onto me, following my every move. I could feel his burning into me from across the room, but whenever I turned to look, he wouldn't flinch. He just kept staring, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he didn't care if I saw him. At first, I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just a weird guy. No harm, right? But it kept happening. Every Friday, there he was, same place, same stare. My brother didn't seem to notice. David was always too busy splashing around in the pool or talking to our friends from class, but I couldn't focus on anything except the man. And the more I tried to ignore him, the more uncomfortable I became. It was like his presence seeped into me, a cold feeling crawling up my back, even though the air was always humid and warm by the pool. One Friday, a few weeks after I first noticed him, I finally mentioned it to David while we were sitting in the hot tub. "Do you see that guy?" I asked, nodding subtly in the man's direction. David shrugged, not even glancing over. "What guy?" I tilted my head toward the man, trying to be discreet. "The tall one, over there by the bleachers. He's been here every week, just watching." David gave a quick glance, his eyes scanning the pool area, but then he just shook his head. "I don't see anyone. You're being weird." That hit me like a punch in the gut. How could David not see him? The man was right there, clear as day. But then again, maybe David wasn't paying attention. Maybe I was just more sensitive to the creepy vibes this guy was giving off. I didn't press it. I just nodded, letting the conversation drop, even though my stomach was twisted up in knots. Something wasn't right. The following week, though, is when things got worse, much worse. We were at the community center again, same routine as always. We swam for about an hour, and then David and I made our way over to the hot tub. I kept my eyes peeled, waiting for the man to appear, and sure enough, there he was. standing by the side of the pool, that eerie red skin catching the light. But this time there was something different. He was closer, much closer than usual. I could see every detail of his face now. His skin wasn't just red, it looked raw, like it had been scraped or burned. His eyes were wide and glassy, like they didn't belong in his head. And the worst part, he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, though, more like a twisted grin, too wide, showing too many teeth. I could feel the fear bubbling up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was just some creepy guy who didn't know how to act around other people. But then he did something that made my heart nearly stop. He lifted one long, bony hand and pointed directly at me. Not in a subtle way, either. It was like he was calling me out, challenging me. His finger was trembling, and his grin got wider, if that was even possible. It felt like the air around me had gotten heavier, like it was harder to breathe. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the red, raw skin and that awful grin, like he knew something I didn't. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that this was just some creepy guy at the pool and nothing more. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Things escalated quickly after that. The next day, I saw him again, except this time, it wasn't at the pool. I was at the grocery store with my mom, just grabbing some snacks for the weekend, when I felt that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned around, and there he was, standing at the end of the aisle, just staring at me like before. My heart pounded in my chest, and I grabbed my mom's arm, pulling her toward the checkout as fast as I could. "Mom, we need to go," I whispered, my voice shaking. She looked at me like I was being ridiculous. "What's the rush? We haven't even finished." "No, we need to go," I insisted, my voice rising. I didn't even try to explain. How could I? How do you tell your mom that some strange red-skinned man has been following you for weeks? She wouldn't believe me. No one would. So I just stayed quiet and pulled her out of the store, my eyes darting back and forth the whole time. When we finally got in the car, I looked around, scanning the parking lot. The man was gone, or maybe he was never there at all. That's what I kept telling myself. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe it was all in my head. But the next time I saw him, I knew it wasn't. It was a Wednesday, middle of the week, totally ordinary day. I was sitting in class trying to focus on math when I felt that familiar, awful sensation creep up my spine. It was like the room had suddenly gotten colder, and I just knew. I turned to look out the window, and there he was, standing outside the school, just beyond the fence. His eyes were locked on mine, that same twisted grin on his face. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, and no one else seemed to notice him. Not my classmates, not the teacher. No one. It was like I was the only one who could see him. I don't even know how I made it through that day. All I wanted to do was run. But where could I go? It was like he was everywhere, following me, watching me. I felt trapped, suffocated by his presence. And the worst part was, I didn't understand why. Why me? What did he want? By the time Friday rolled around again, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't want to go to the pool. I didn't even want to leave the house. But my parents insisted, saying it would do me good to stick to my routine. I didn't tell them about the man, about how terrified I was. What was the point? They'd just think I was being dramatic. So I went. David was excited as usual, but I was on edge the entire time, my eyes scanning the pool area for any sign of him. And then, when we got to the hot tub, he was there. But this time he was sitting inside it, right where we usually sat. I froze, my feet glued to the floor. The water around him wasn't bubbling like it should have been. It was still, eerily still, and he was just waiting. His red skin seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, and his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, never left mine. David must have noticed something was wrong because he tugged on my arm. "Hey, you okay?" I didn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off the man. He was smiling again, that horrible grin, and I swear in that moment I heard something. A whisper. Not from the man, but from somewhere inside my head. It was faint, almost like a memory, but I could make out the words, "Come closer." Without even thinking, I took a step forward. I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was being pulled toward him, like he had some kind of hold on me. David's voice sounded far away as he called my name, but I couldn't stop. But just as I reached out, something snapped me back. I stumbled, breaking eye contact, and the next thing I knew, David was pulling me away, his face pale and full of worry. We didn't go back to the pool after that. My parents didn't ask questions, they just assumed we'd lost interest, and I never saw the man again. But even now, years later, I can still feel his eyes on me, like he's still out there, waiting, biding his time. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that whisper again. Come closer. It's been years since that day, but I still can't shake the feeling that he's somewhere close. I know it sounds strange, and maybe I sound paranoid, but I swear, sometimes I feel his presence as if he's just around the corner, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And I keep having these dreams. They started not long after that last time at the pool. At first, it was simple stuff, walking down a hallway or sitting in a quiet room, but in every dream, I'd eventually see him. He'd be waiting for me, that red skin glowing in the darkness, his eyes fixed on me, and always with that eerie grin. No matter how much I tried to wake up, my legs would keep carrying me closer. The dream would always end the same way. Just as I reached out to take his hand, I'd wake up, covered in cold sweat, my heart racing. One night, though, the dream was different. I was back at the pool, only it looked older, abandoned, like it hadn't been used in years. The water was dark and murky, and the hot tub was empty. No bubbles, no warmth, just a black, still pool of water. The air was thick with this damp, musty smell, like mold had taken over everything. And then, I heard it, that same whisper I'd heard back at the pool. Come closer. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor as I looked around, searching for the man. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't see him. The whisper got louder, almost insistent, echoing off the walls and filling my head until I couldn't think of anything else. The air grew colder and heavier, pressing down on me until I felt like I was suffocating. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing by the edge of the hot tub, watching me with that same twisted smile. But this time, he didn't wait. He stepped into the water, his body sinking down as if the dark pool was swallowing him whole. But his eyes never left mine. Even as the water reached his neck, his mouth, his eyes, he was still staring at me. I jolted awake, gasping for breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. But even after I realized it was just a dream, the coldness didn't leave. It felt like he was still there, lingering, watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. I tried everything to get rid of the dreams. I went to therapy, talked to people, tried to forget about him. For a while, I thought maybe I'd succeeded. The dreams stopped, and I started to feel normal again. But the other day, he came back. I was in a cafe, just having a coffee, minding my own business, when I felt it, that cold, heavy feeling I hadn't felt in years. I looked up, and there he was, standing outside the window, his red skin pale under the streetlight, his eyes locked onto mine. It was like no time had passed at all. He looked the same twisted grin, same unblinking stare, as if he'd been waiting this whole time. And then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, like a voice carried on the wind. Come closer. I don't know what he is or what he wants, but I know he's not going away. I can feel it deep down, like he's part of me now, lurking just beneath the surface. And every time I see him, every time I hear that voice, it gets a little harder to resist. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. Maybe one day I won't be able to wake up. Maybe one day I'll answer him. And when that day comes, I'm afraid I won't be coming back. All right, so this happened a few years back, but it still gives me chills just talking about it. I never believed in ghosts, not really. Sure, I'd seen my fair share of horror movies, heard all the stories people tell around campfires, but I always thought they were just that, stories. Until that night. Until the night I found myself standing outside the old nurse's office, trembling like I'd never trembled before. I was in high school then, a junior, and it was just before Halloween. The air was getting colder, the days were getting shorter, and everything just had that feel, like something was in the air, a kind of electricity that made you want to do something a little crazy. That's how my friends and I ended up there, at the school, in the middle of the night, doing something we knew we probably shouldn't have been doing. It started with a dare, as these things always do. My friend Luke, tall, skinny, a bit of a prankster, was the one who suggested it. Have you guys heard about the nurse's office? He asked, a glint in his eye that I should have recognized as trouble. We were all gathered around after school, waiting for our rides or just killing time before heading home. I laughed. You mean the one by the old gym? The one they never use anymore? Luke nodded, leaning in like he was about to reveal some deep, dark secret. They say it's haunted. Like, people have heard screaming coming from inside, even though it's been empty for years. Apparently, a nurse died there, and if you knock on the door, you can hear her scream back. I rolled my eyes, trying to act unimpressed. That's just a stupid rumor, probably just the wind or something. You really think a ghost is living in our school? But the others looked interested, and I could feel myself getting curious too. We all liked a good scare, and Halloween was just around the corner, so the timing was perfect. So Luke, of course, dared us to go to the nurse's office that night and knock on the door. Just knock 3 times, wait and see what happens. If you're so brave, then prove it, he'd said, grinning that cocky grin of his. And somehow, against my better judgment, I agreed. So that night, there we were, me, Luke, Sarah, and Danny. Just the 4 of us, standing outside the locked doors of our high school, the entire place dark and eerily quiet. I didn't think about it at the time, but looking back, the air that night had felt strange. Colder than usual, with this weird stillness, like even the wind was holding its breath. The lights from the street cast these long, twisted shadows across the building, making it look more like a haunted house than a school. Luke had managed to get one of the back doors open. Don't ask me how. Luke always seemed to know ways to get into places he shouldn't. We snuck in, trying to be as quiet as possible, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Every sound seemed magnified, from the scuff of our sneakers to the slight creak of the floor as we walked. We passed the rows of lockers, their doors shut tight like they were hiding secrets. The classrooms, with their desks and chairs lined up in perfect rows, looked different in the dark, almost menacing. And the air, oh God, the air in there felt thick, stale, like no one had breathed it for years. It smelled faintly of old textbooks and cleaning chemicals, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Finally, we reached the hallway that led to the nurse's office. I'd walked down that hallway 100 times before, but that night it looked different, stretched out and impossibly long. The nurse's office was at the end, its door closed, the frosted glass window covered in a layer of dust. Sarah stopped, hugging her arms around herself. Are we really doing this? She whispered, her voice shaky. Danny, who always tried to act tougher than he was, nodded. Come on, it's just a stupid door. We knock, we wait a few seconds, and we leave. Easy. But it didn't feel easy. As we stood there staring down the hallway at that dusty door, I could feel this heaviness settle over me. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I didn't want to look like a coward, not in front of my friends. So I took a deep breath and nodded. We walked down the hallway, our footsteps slow and hesitant. The closer we got to the door, the colder it seemed to get, like we were walking into a freezer. My breath came out in little white puffs, which made no sense. It was fall, but it shouldn't have been that cold inside. The others must have noticed it too, because they were all looking around, their faces pale in the dim light. When we finally reached the door, I hesitated. The door was covered in dust, thick enough that you could barely make out the letters that read nurse's office. And there was this strange faint smell coming from behind it, like antiseptic mixed with something rotten. It turned my stomach, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just an old, unused room. All right, Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. Here goes nothing. He reached out and knocked on the door 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. We waited, holding our breath, staring at the door like it was about to burst open. For a few seconds there was nothing, just silence. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on us. I started to feel relieved, thinking it had all been just a stupid rumor after all. But then we heard it. A scream, loud, shrill, echoing through the hallway like it was coming from the walls themselves. It was the kind of scream that cuts through you, sharp and raw, full of terror and pain. I felt my blood run cold, and my heart stopped. We all froze, staring at each other, our faces twisted in horror. What the? Danny whispered, but before he could finish, the door started to shake. It rattled, hard, like something, or someone, was trying to force it open from the inside. The sound of the doorknob twisting over and over filled the hallway, and the door itself seemed to bulge, like whatever was behind it was straining against it, desperate to get out. That was it. I lost it. We all did. Without saying a word, we turned and bolted down the hallway, our footsteps pounding against the floor, our breaths coming out in panicked gasps. I could feel my heart racing, the fear flooding my veins like ice water. I didn't dare look back, but I could still hear the door rattling behind us, the scream echoing in my ears. We burst out of the school and didn't stop running until we were halfway down the block. Finally, we collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air, our faces pale and our bodies shaking. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. No one had an answer. We just sat there in silence, trying to process what we'd just experienced. None of it made sense. The scream, the door shaking, the doorknob twisting, it was like something out of a horror movie. But it had been real. We'd all heard it. We'd all seen it. We agreed not to tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe us, anyway? They'd think we were making it up, or worse, that we'd somehow caused the whole thing. So, we kept it to ourselves, trying to forget, trying to pretend it had all been just a bad dream. But that was just the beginning. The next day, strange things started happening. Sarah found scratches on her arm, long, thin red marks that looked like claw marks. She didn't remember getting them, and they stung whenever she touched them. Danny started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where he'd be standing outside the nurse's office, hearing that same scream over and over. And me? Well, I started seeing things. Shadows moving in the corner of my eye. I'd be walking down the hall at school, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see the door to the nurse's office slowly opening. But when I looked straight at it, it was closed. Or I'd be in class, and I'd feel this cold breeze like someone had opened a window, even though all the windows were shut tight. One night, a few weeks after it happened, I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. I was half asleep when I heard it again. That scream, faint but unmistakable, like it was coming from far away, just barely audible. I sat up, my heart racing, and stared into the darkness, trying to tell myself it was just my imagination. But then, I heard a knock. The 3 knocks echoed through my room, each one clear and distinct, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, frozen, listening in silence, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The knocks came from my bedroom door, and I was too terrified to move. My mind raced, trying to come up with some logical explanation, but there was none. Then I heard it. That same voice, the scream I'd heard that night at school, except now it was quiet and hoarse, almost like a whisper. "Let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edge of my blanket so hard my knuckles went white. I told myself it couldn't be real, that it had to be a nightmare, but the voice didn't stop. "Let me in." I don't know how long I sat there, listening to that faint, pleading whisper. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, the voice stopped, and my room went completely silent. I opened my eyes, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just my dark, empty room, the shadows dancing on the walls. The next day at school, I was a wreck. I barely slept, and my mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. I found Luke, Sarah, and Danny during lunch, and the minute they saw me, I could tell they looked just as shaken as I felt. Did anyone else hear it?" I whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Danny nodded, his face pale. "The knocks, last night, 3 of them, and that voice." He shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. It sounded like it was in my room, like someone was standing right there. Sarah looked down, her hands trembling. I thought I was dreaming, but when I woke up, there were marks on my door. She showed us her phone, and my stomach dropped when I saw the photo. 3 long, dark scratches on her bedroom door, like something had clawed at it from the outside. We didn't know what to do. Everything that was happening was impossible to explain, but it was happening to all of us, and it wasn't stopping. After a long, tense silence, Luke spoke up. "I think we need to go back." We all looked at him like he was crazy. "Go back? Are you insane?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "Look, I don't want to, all right?" he said, his face grim. But whatever this thing is, it's not leaving us alone. Maybe if we go back, we can figure out what it wants. Maybe we can make it stop. It sounded insane, but a part of me wondered if he was right. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every shadow, hearing voices in the middle of the night. And so, against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I agreed. We all did. That night, after the school closed, we met at the back door, the same one we'd snuck in through before. The air was colder than it had been, a biting chill that felt unnatural for fall. The school loomed above us, dark and silent, every window like a hollow, watching eye. I felt a shiver run through me, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that this was the only way. Luke opened the door, and we slipped inside, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. This time it felt different, darker. The air was thick with something heavy and oppressive, like the building itself was alive and breathing. We made our way to the nurse's office, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, the beams dancing on the walls. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched. When we finally reached the hallway that led to the nurse's office, we stopped, each of us feeling that same creeping dread we'd felt before. The door was exactly as we'd left it, dusty, closed, silent. But this time there was something different. A faint outline of handprints on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hands against it from the other side. The sight of it made my skin crawl. "All right," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. "We knock, just like before, 3 times. Sarah grabbed his arm, her face pale. "Are you sure about this?" He hesitated, but then nodded, swallowing hard. "It's the only way." He lifted his hand and knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. We held our breath, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. For a moment, there was nothing. Just that awful stillness, that suffocating cold. I could feel my heart pounding, my palms sweating as I waited, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. We stumbled back, staring in horror as the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The air that rushed out was colder than anything I'd ever felt, so cold it burned my skin. I could barely see anything beyond the doorway, just shadows shifting in the darkness. And then, a figure appeared. It was a woman, at least I think it was. She was pale, almost translucent, with long dark hair that hung over her face, her body thin and gaunt. Her clothes were tattered, like a nurse's uniform, but old and faded, stained with something dark. She stepped forward, her movements slow and jerky, like she hadn't walked in years. We all froze, too terrified to move, as she raised her head and looked at us, her eyes hollow and empty. And then she opened her mouth, letting out that same scream we'd heard before, a sound so raw and full of pain that it felt like it was tearing through my chest. We didn't wait. We turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway, our footsteps echoing as her scream followed us, growing louder, more desperate. I could feel her behind us, like a cold wind pressing against my back, like she was reaching for us, her fingers inches from grabbing me. We burst through the doors, gasping for breath, and didn't stop running until we were out of the school and halfway down the street. When we finally stopped, I turned to look back, half expecting to see her standing there in the doorway, watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty, silent school. The next day, we went to the principal, desperate to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But when we brought up the nurse's office, he looked at us like we were insane. "What are you talking about?" he asked, frowning. "That room hasn't been used in years. The nurse's office was moved to the other side of the school. The old one was boarded up ages ago." We stared at him in shock. "But we went in there," I stammered. "We saw something." He shook his head. "The door is sealed shut. No one's been in there for years." I wanted to argue, to tell him what we'd seen, but I knew he wouldn't believe us. And deep down, a part of me didn't want to know the truth. We'd seen her, and we'd heard her scream, and that was enough. We never went back to that hallway again. None of us talked about it after that. It was like an unspoken agreement, a pact we'd made in silence. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scream in my dreams. And every now and then, I'll wake up to the sound of 3 knocks at my door.